Hello, so sliders are by far the most interesting and versatile object in us, so I'd say it's a pretty good idea to know how they actually work. Let's start with some hard facts first. As a player, you should have already noticed by now that hitting a slider too early or too late will still allow you to get a 300. This is called slider timing leniency, and is useful for mapping awkward rhythms, although with Score V2 looming over our heads whenever it comes, it might not be the best idea to rely solely on it. Then there's the slider tail, which doesn't require an active roll from the player, so it's good for weird BPM or polarity changes. This has been talked about before in quite a few places. Let's take a look at something you might not know. Here we have a very fast and stupid looking slider. Where do you think the slider tail is? Well, that's obvious. Here, right? Well, actually, it's here. In play, the slider tail position is calculated 36 milliseconds before the physical end of the slider. This is something that only becomes apparent for very fast sliders, but it's something to keep in mind. It doesn't seem to apply to slider ticks though, however. Okay, enough facts, let's get back to theory. Slider shapes. This heavily ties in with aesthetics and structure, which has been talked about before, but there's a few things I can still talk about here. In most maps, you will see three types of basic slider: a straight slider, a smooth curve, and a linear bend. Only the latter two will influence angular momentum, but they both play pretty much the same, so why would a mapper choose one over the other? Because aesthetics. The full theory behind aesthetics will probably be covered in another video, but all you need to know now is that aesthetics is a visual response. Here is a typical map to an upbeat anime theme. What kind of slider do you see the most often? Curves, right? Now here's a more techno song. How about now? Well, there's more variety, but there are definitely some linear bends that you didn't see in the previous song. Think of it like this. Curves are pretty general, so you can use them pretty much everywhere. They represent smoothness, and so upbeat songs tend to use them a lot. Linear curves are more aggressive looking, kinda like knives, I guess, so they're used for more harsher sounds. Straight sliders are fairly neutral. You'll see them in every genre, but tend to pop up more on harsher sounds. For both smooth and linear bends, you can also change how sharp the path is. Sharper sliders can look very out of place, so in most maps they aren't used very often. But if you break structure and consistency, they could be used to emphasize certain sounds very well. Overlapping sliders are becoming more common for expressing certain sounds, whether they are tail flicks or looping sliders. What players seem to prefer to do is take the path of least resistance, so if the path isn't clear or is awkward to play, they tend to break the intentional path of the slider. Players exiting the slider early could potentially ruin the effect the slider is trying to give, so apart from having a clear slider path, which you should do anyway, one method of forcing players to the end of a slider is to place the next object beneath the slider tail. Placing objects beneath or overlap with the tail in general can help emphasize the full length of the slider. Having breaks in the rhythm will naturally let players reach the slider tail, since they have nowhere else to go anyway. Reverse sliders can also force players to move to where the reverse arrow is. Mostly. Repeating sliders work since they are a fairly common mapping technique, and players have learned how to deal with them easily. 1-2 repeaters are just long enough to not be natural to play like a typical repeater, but short enough that it's awkward to read otherwise, so they're usually discouraged. Alright, final point. Slider velocity. Watch this. Notice how the loud sounds were mapped? The sliders here are much faster compared to the other rhythms. Okay, how about this one? This time, the much lower intensity part of the song is mapped with lower slider velocity. These are fairly extreme cases, but in general, strong beats and sections are emphasized with high slider velocity, and weaker beats and sections with lower slider velocity. Changing velocity so suddenly in the middle of a combo can feel extremely out of place and unexpected for the player, so you should map in such a way that is readable or predictable. Note density usually correlates with slider velocity, so changing your note density can help make slider velocity changes a bit more predictable. Otherwise, the music itself can be predictable in how it changes intensity, so you can map accordingly. As for giving a more visual cue, the guidelines recommend slider ticks, but in practice they don't really help a lot. Instead, mappers often use new combos to indicate slider velocity changes. To avoid confusion, you should usually not place similar length sliders of different velocities near each other. As for your base slider velocity, you should try to find a slider velocity that matches well with your base spacing, because high slider velocity for low spacing, or vice versa, is just wrong. This will require some experimentation, and getting it right at the start of your map is important, because changing it later is just absolute hell. Trust me.